A vast line of weeping families moves slowly across a broken dusty road. Behind them, the horizon is thick with black smoke. The biblical writers do not describe the fall of Jerusalem simply as a military defeat or a geopolitical disaster. The Assyrians breached the walls, slaughtered the leadership, and dragged the population away. They disappeared. 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel vanished into the bloodlines and cultures of the surrounding pagan nations. They became the lost tribes, swallowed up by the empire. The physical displacement was simply the final, a tragic result of a spiritual displacement that had occurred centuries earlier, hundreds of miles to the south. The smaller kingdom of Judah watches the smoke rise from the north. They see their brothers annihilated. But instead of falling to their knees in repentance, the leaders in Jerusalem feel a false sense of security. They look at the massive stone walls of their city. They look at the smoking altars of Solomon's temple. They remind themselves that they have the royal bloodline of David sitting on the throne. The common interpretation in the streets of Jerusalem is that God would never allow his holy city to fall. They believe the temple is a magic talisman that guarantees their safety, regardless of how corrupt their society becomes. But they have missed the terrifying lesson of the Assyrian scatter. God will not allow his presence to be used as a shield for a rebellious people. A building cannot protect a nation. If you look closely at how the prophets and historians record this tragedy, a hidden architecture emerges, whose hearts are already living in the far country. Judah believes they are the exception to the rule, but a darker, heavier shadow is already gathering on the horizon. The road east is about to open again, and this time, the flames will reach the sanctuary. The massive cedar beams of Solomon's temple do not simply burn. They collapse with a deafening roar, sending a shockwave of white ash across the blood-stained streets of Jerusalem. It is 586 BC. We have returned to the dusty road, the dragging chains, and the weeping families from the very beginning of our story. The Babylonian war machine, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, has starved the city for months. Now, they have shattered the walls. They have slaughtered the priests. They have dragged the last king of Judah into the dirt, executed his sons in front of him, and then gouged out his eyes, so that his family's death is the final image he will ever see. For the captives marching away from the smoke, this is not just a geopolitical disaster. It is a theological earthquake. For centuries, the people of Judah had anchored their entire existence to 3 supposedly unbreakable pillars. They deliberately use an ancient vocabulary to tell the story of 586 BC. The weeping in Babylon is not a new event. It is a terrifying echo. They lived in the Promised Land. They were ruled by the eternal bloodline of David, and they possessed the temple where God himself dwelled. They believed these guarantees made them invincible. But in a single afternoon, the land is conquered. The king is blinded, and the temple is reduced to rubble. The deepest crisis of the Old Testament hangs in the choking air. Has the covenant failed? Did the gods of Babylon simply overpower the God of Israel? The prophets who survived the slaughter, men like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, refused to let the people believe this is a tragic accident. They forced the captives to confront a terrifying reality. Babylon did not win because God was weak. Babylon won because God opened the gates. The physical destruction of Jerusalem is the inevitable, visible result of a nation that had already spent centuries abandoning their creator. They had worshipped pagan idols, exploited the poor, and ignored generation after generation of prophetic warnings. And as the survivors are forced into a brutal, months-long death march toward the center of the Babylonian Empire, the ancient geography returns to tell the true story. Look at the direction of their chains. They are marching east. The temple they leave behind was deliberately designed to be a replica of Eden, covered in intricate carvings of blooming palm trees, open flowers, and pomegranates. It was guarded by massive golden statues of cherubim. Notice the physical direction of the captives' forced march. They are not just wandering aimlessly into the desert. They are being pulled inexorably in one specific direction. As the Babylonian flames consume those angels, The people of Judah are experiencing Genesis 3 all over again. They are Adam and Eve, weeping on the road, looking back at a locked and burning gate. Up to this point in the biblical narrative, we have watched this pattern relentlessly expand. It began with a single couple driven east from a garden. It escalated into a family trapped in an Egyptian house of slavery. It fractured a kingdom and scattered 10 tribes into the Assyrian wind. Now, the exile has swallowed the final remnant of the chosen people. The physical kingdom has collapsed. Humanity is entirely homeless again. By the rivers of Babylon, the captives sit down in the dirt and weep. Psalm 137 records that they hang their harps on the willow trees, refusing to sing the songs of Zion in a foreign land. If the land is lost, the temple is burned, and the people are enslaved in the most powerful pagan empire on earth. How can the story possibly move forward? The silence does not last. In the absolute darkest moment of biblical history, the prophets begin to speak again, and they introduce a single Hebrew word that changes the entire trajectory of the exile. Section 6, a pattern in the prophets. In the dust of Babylon, a strange new sound begins to emerge among the weeping captives. They are moving east. In the biblical imagination, geography is never just geography. It reveals a spiritual condition. It is not the sound of mourning, but the startling language of hope. The prophets, who had accurately predicted the destruction of Jerusalem, now begin to promise something that seems historically and militarily impossible: a return. Men like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel begin to write about a second, greater exodus. They promise that God will open a highway in the wilderness, break the heavy chains of the empire, and lead his displaced people back to the promised land. But as these prophets describe this massive rescue operation, they do not just use the language of political liberation. They use a very specific Hebrew verb that permanently changes how we understand the exile. The word is shuv. In its most basic, physical sense. In the ancient world, shuv means to turn around, to go back, or to return to a starting point. If a traveler realizes they are walking the wrong direction on a road, they literally turn their body around and retrace their steps. But the biblical prophets take this ordinary geographic word and load it with massive theological weight. In our English Bibles, this single Hebrew word is translated in two very different ways, depending on the context of the sentence. Sometimes it is translated simply as return, referring to the physical journey of a captive walking back to Jerusalem. But in other passages, the exact same word is translated as repent, referring to the spiritual journey of. The central question is not simply why the Babylonians won the war. The deeper question is why the biblical narrative is repeatedly locked, a rebel turning back to God. The English translation is accurate, but it splits the concept into two different ideas. The original Hebrew audience would have heard a single, unified action. The prophets are fusing geographic return with spiritual repentance. They are revealing that a physical return to the land is absolutely meaningless without a spiritual return to the Father. The ultimate problem was never the Babylonian army. The ultimate problem was the human heart. This is why Jeremiah promises a new covenant. He declares that the day is coming when God will not merely write his law on external tablets of stone, but he will write it directly into the desires and affections of the people. God is not just going to bring them out of Babylon. He is going to cure the internal wandering that sent them there in the first place. 70 years later, the geopolitical borders actually shift. The Persian Empire conquers Babylon and allows the Jewish captives to pack their bags and go home. They walk back west. Under leaders like Ezra and Nehemiah, they rebuild the stone walls of Jerusalem. They construct a second temple. It seems like the great prophetic promises of Shuv have finally been fulfilled. But a dark, quiet realization begins to settle over the returning remnant. They are physically back in the land. But the massive, earth-shaking promises of the prophets do not fully materialize. When the foundation of the Second Temple is laid, the older men who remember, in a continuous, agonizing cycle of humanity losing its home, why does God's story always seem to end in forced removal? The glory of Solomon's temple do not cheer, they weep loudly in disappointment. The new building is a shadow of the original. The glorious presence of God does not descend in fire. The nation remains fractured, constantly bullied and taxed by successive foreign empires. The physical chains are gone, but the internal distance remains. They are home, yet they are still fundamentally in exile. Centuries pass in agonizing silence. The people wait, desperate for the true return to begin, until a teacher arrives in the Galilean countryside and reframes their entire national history into a single, devastating story. A crowd of religious leaders stands in the dust of the Galilean countryside, muttering in disgust. They are watching a rabbi sit and eat with tax collectors, traitors, and notorious sinners. To the Pharisees, this is a scandalous violation of boundaries. But Jesus does not apologize for who he is eating with. Instead, he answers their grumbling by telling a story about a wealthy landowner and his two sons. We know it as the parable of the prodigal son. It is perhaps the most famous story Jesus ever told, but most readers miss the massive historical architecture hidden beneath the surface of the parable. The younger son approaches his father and demands his share of the inheritance. In the ancient Near East, this is an unthinkable insult. This is not ultimately a story about an ancient Middle Eastern border dispute. It is a story about the human soul's profound distance from its creator. The son is essentially telling his father, "I wish you were dead. I want your wealth, but I do not want you." The father silently grants the request. The son gathers his newfound fortune and journeys into a far country. Notice the geography of his rebellion. He does not just move down the street. He travels to a distant land. Who else demanded autonomy, took the gifts of the father, and walked into a distant land? Adam and Eve, driven east from Eden, the descendants of Abraham, wandering down into Egypt. The kingdom of Judah, dragged in chains to Babylon. Jesus is not just telling a sentimental story about a rebellious teenager. He is compressing the entire traumatic history of Israel and the fundamental tragedy of all humanity into a single, personal narrative. We are the younger son. We have all taken the gifts of God, demanded our autonomy, and walked away down the road east. In the far country, the illusion of freedom quickly collapses. A severe famine strikes the land. The son loses everything. He is forced to hire himself out to a Gentile farmer, where he ends up in the mud, feeding pigs. We tend to treat salvation as a simple legal transaction or a distant ticket to heaven. But the Bible frames it entirely differently. For a Jewish audience listening to Jesus, this is the absolute bottom. Pigs were ritually unclean. The son is starving, cut off from his family, covered in filth, and enslaved in a foreign land. He is in exile. Then, the text says, he came to himself. He remembers the abundance of his father's house. He makes a decision. He will turn around. He will retrace his steps. He will shuv. He practices his speech of repentance in the mud. "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants." He believes the return is going to be a transaction. He thinks he has to earn his way back into the courtyard, much like the nation of Israel believed. They had to perfectly obey the law to end their national exile. He expects a master, but the father breaks every cultural rule of the ancient world. When the son is still a long way off, the father sees him. An elderly Middle Eastern patriarch in the 1st century would never sprint. It was considered deeply undignified. The entire scriptural narrative is a single, unified story of God, orchestrating the ultimate return for a displaced people. But this father lifts his heavy robes, exposes his legs, and runs down the dusty road. He throws his arms around a filthy, pig-smelling rebel and kisses him. He puts a ring on his finger and shoes on his feet. The father absorbs the shame of the son to bring him home. The exile is over for the boy. But the story creates a massive theological tension. In the parable, the father simply runs and forgives. But in the real world of biblical justice, a debt that large cannot simply be ignored. The father runs to the son. But to permanently bring humanity's exile to an end, someone has to pay the ultimate cost of the journey. The heavy, rough-hewn wooden beam digs into his bleeding shoulders as he stumbles through the narrow, crowded streets of Jerusalem. The Roman guards force him forward, pushing through the noise, the dust, and the spit of the crowd until they reach the heavy stone gates of the city. And then, they march him outside. Most readers focus intensely on the physical agony of the cross. But the geography of the crucifixion is just as deliberate as the iron nails. The massive stone walls of Jerusalem have been breached. The sacred temple, a building intentionally decorated with carved pomegranates, blooming palm trees. The trauma of Babylon validates a spiritual homesickness that still haunts us today. We all know what it feels like to live in a world that is fractured. Jesus is not executed on the bronze altar of the temple. He is not sacrificed safely inside the walls of the holy city. The writer of Hebrews specifically points out the theological significance of this location, noting that Jesus suffered outside the gate. In the ancient biblical world, outside the camp was the desolate realm of the unclean, the cursed, and the rejected. On the Day of Atonement, while one goat was sacrificed inside the sanctuary, a second animal, the scapegoat, was loaded with the sins of the nation and driven away into the wilderness. It was sent into exile. When Jesus is nailed to the wood at Golgotha, the entire massive, tragic history of human displacement reaches its violent climax. Every symbol of the ancient eviction is compressed into this single moment. In Genesis 3, the ground was cursed to produce thorns and thistles. Now, the king wears a crown woven from those same thorns. In Eden, Adam and Eve realized their nakedness and tried to hide in shame. Now, the Son of God is stripped naked and exposed before a mocking empire. But the most terrifying moment of the crucifixion is not the physical pain. It is the spiritual dislocation. At noon, the sky turns pitch black. The physical light of the sun is extinguished, mirroring a far deeper, cosmic darkness. We all recognize the lingering sense that we do not quite belong here, and we constantly chase temporary shelters that never entirely cure our restlessness. For the first time in eternity, the Son is completely separated from the comforting presence of the Father. He screams from the cross into the darkness, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He is experiencing the ultimate Babylon. He is living in the far country. This is the staggering, hidden mechanism of the gospel. Jesus does not merely stand in heaven and declare that our exile is over. He does not shout forgiveness from the safety of the garden. He is the true older brother who refuses to stay comfortably in the Father's house, but instead walks out into the distant land to find his starving sibling. He leaves the courtyard. He steps past the flaming sword of the cherubim. He willingly walks down the dusty, blood-stained road, moving east, directly into the darkest depths of human separation, to find us in the mud. He absorbs the full weight of the Babylonian captivity of the human soul. He takes our eviction upon himself. He becomes the exile, so that we can finally walk west. When Jesus breathes his last, the Gospel of Matthew records a highly specific architectural detail. Inside the city, deep within the temple, the massive, heavy veil, separating the Holy of Holies from the rest of the building, is violently torn in two, from top to bottom. The Bible names this feeling. It calls it exile. It is the universal human condition. We are all born on the road, moving east. Remember what was intricately embroidered on that veil. It was woven with the towering images of cherubim. For thousands of years, the angelic guard had blocked the way back to the unhindered presence of God. Now, the gate is suddenly, violently open. The flaming sword is extinguished by the blood of the exiled king. The historical work is finished. The road back to the Father is clear. But a torn veil in an ancient temple does not automatically heal the restless wandering of the modern human heart. The cosmic rescue is complete. And this brings the reality of the far country directly to your door. The torn veil in Jerusalem is a historical fact. But the reality of the far country is a deeply personal experience. Up to this point, we have traced the exile of humanity across empires, centuries, and continents. But the question is no longer about what happened to the ancient Israelites in Babylon or the younger son in the parable. The question is, what is happening to you? Look closely at your own life. Look at the anxiety that hums quietly in the background of your ordinary week. Look at the persistent, nagging feeling of isolation, even when you are surrounded by people. Look at the frantic ways we all try to build. But to understand the chains in Babylon, and to understand the blueprint of our own spiritual wandering, secure, permanent homes in our careers, our relationships, or our bank accounts, only to watch those shelters eventually leak, fracture, or collapse completely. We are entirely modern people, but we are suffering from an ancient homesickness. We are still feeling the devastating friction of living east of Eden. Perhaps your exile feels like a place you accidentally wandered into through a season of profound grief, illness, or sudden trauma. Or perhaps, like the prodigal son, your far country is a destination you stubbornly chose. You took the gifts God gave you, demanded your autonomy, and walked away. Now, you are staring at the wreckage of a decision, a hidden habit, or a broken relationship, convinced that you have traveled too far down the road east to ever turn around. You believe the distance is permanent. You assume that if God looks at you at all, He looks at you with the folded arms of a disappointed manager, waiting for you to clean yourself up, pay off your debts, and earn your way back into the courtyard. But the cross shatters that assumption entirely. This is not ultimately a story about behavioral modification or religious performance. It is a story about a father who refuses to leave you in the mud. Salvation is not merely a cold, legal transaction where a cosmic judge stamps a passport so you can escape to heaven when you die. Salvation is a homecoming. When you turn around, when you finally shove and decide, we cannot start in the ashes of Jerusalem. We have to travel much further back. We have to return. To retrace your steps, you do not find a locked gate. You do not find a flaming sword. You find a father who has already sprinted down the dusty road, exposing himself to the shame and the judgment of the world, just to throw his arms around your exhausted neck. You are not defined by the far country you have wandered into. You are defined by the God who entered the exile to bring you out. What are you trying to control in the distant land? What false Egypt are you trusting to provide for your security? What have you mistaken for a home? The invitation of the gospel is to drop the heavy bags of your own self-salvation and simply walk west. But even when we accept that invitation, a profound tension remains. We are forgiven, and we are brought into the family. But look out the window. Our physical bodies still break. Our relationships still experience friction. Our world is still saturated in pain, disease, and death. We are spiritually home, but we are physically still waiting for the fullness of the restoration to arrive. The biblical story cannot end here. It does not end with us simply returning to the original, fragile garden where the failure began. It ends with a garden expanding into something entirely new. Step back and look at the massive architecture of the biblical story. We began with a weeping family walking away from a burning city, to the origin of the road, to the very first time humanity was forced to look back at a locked gate, convinced that their displacement was merely a geopolitical disaster. But the pattern revealed a much larger reality. From the original fracture in Eden to the mud of Egypt, from the scattered tribes of Assyria to the weeping captives of Babylon, the entire Bible is the story of a humanity desperate for a home. We have discovered three profound truths along this journey. First, our deepest problem is not our physical circumstances, but our spiritual distance from our Creator. Second, God did not simply demand that we fix our own wandering. He entered the far country himself to become the road back. And third, the homesickness you feel today is not a sign of God's absence, but the undeniable proof that you were created for another world. But the story does not end with us simply walking back into the original garden. The book of Revelation brings the narrative to its final, breathtaking conclusion. The Apostle John receives a vision of the new heaven and the new earth. He sees a holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven. Notice what is inside the city. The tree of life has returned. The river of living water is flowing freely. It is Eden restored. But notice what has changed. In Genesis 3, the defining tragedy of human history was a closed door, long before the Babylonians breached the walls of Jerusalem. Another boundary was crossed, and long before a nation was forced to pack its bags, Adam and Eve were driven out. The cherubim were stationed at the entrance with a flaming sword. The gate was locked, and humanity was forced onto the road east. Now, look at the architecture of the new city. Revelation 21 explicitly describes the massive, towering walls of the New Jerusalem. It has 12 gates, but in verse 25, John writes a detail that permanently shatters the ancient pattern of exile. He writes, "And its gates will never be shut. The cherubim have put down the flaming sword. The angelic guard is gone. The gates face every direction, and they are permanently locked open. There is no more road east." The tragic cycle of eviction, slavery, and wandering has finally burned away. God is no longer dwelling in a restricted temple built by human hands. Revelation declares that the dwelling place of God is now entirely with man. He will wipe away every tear, including the tears we wept by the rivers of Babylon. When you feel the ache of homesickness in your ordinary life, when you feel the friction of a broken world, let it remind you that this temporary shelter is not your final destination. You do not have to wander the earth trying to build an artificial Eden. A single couple was forced to walk away from the only home they had ever known. If we want to understand why the Bible that will eventually collapse, you do not have to live in the shame of the far country. The exiled king has already paid the cost of the journey. He has already torn the veil. He has already secured your return. The gate is open, and you are finally coming home. Is obsessed with exile. We have to open the very first book. Genesis 3 records the most catastrophic fracture in human history. The rebellion in Eden is usually taught as a story about the origin of sin and death. We focus on the fruit, the serpent, and the curse, and golden cherubim to resemble a perfect. Ancient garden has been stripped of its gold, set on fire, and reduced to rubble. Chains drag against the dirt, but look closely at the immediate, physical consequence of that rebellion. The punishment is not just mortality. The punishment is displacement. God removes the man and the woman from the garden. The text uses a specific, aggressive verb. In Hebrew, the word is garash. It does not mean to politely ask someone to leave or to suggest a departure. It means to drive out, to expel, to forcefully cast away. It is the language of divorce and sudden eviction. The translation is accurate, but the original term carries an additional sense of irreversible separation. Adam and Eve are not going on a journey, they are being banished. But the detail that changes how we read the rest of the Bible is found in the geography of that banishment. Genesis 3:24 says, "He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. They are driven east. The gate is locked behind them. A terrifying angelic guard with a blade of fire is stationed at the entrance, ensuring they can never simply walk back in." This is the original exile. This is the moment humanity becomes a race of wanderers, homesick for a garden they cannot enter, living in a world of thorns and shadows. Once this pattern becomes visible, the architecture of the rest of Genesis reads entirely differently. It is 586 BC, and the surviving citizens of Judah are being forced into a brutal death march toward the center of the Babylonian Empire. The road east becomes the defining trajectory of human failure. When Cain murders his brother Abel, What is his punishment? He is driven away from the presence of the Lord. And the text specifically notes that he settles in the land of Nod, east of Eden. When humanity unites to build the Tower of Babel in an arrogant attempt to construct their own artificial holy mountain, the text quietly mentions that they settled on a plain in Shinar, which is to the east. When Abraham's nephew Lot chooses the fertile, wicked plains of Sodom over the promised land, Genesis deliberately tells us he journeyed east. Moving east is the biblical shorthand for moving away from the presence of God. This explains why the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC was so devastating. The temple in Jerusalem was explicitly designed to be a miniature, symbolic Eden. The walls were carved with blooming trees and pomegranates. The entrance into the Holy of Holies was guarded by massive statues of cherubim. When Israel was dragged east to Babylon, the prophets recognized exactly what was happening. It was Genesis 3 all over again. The cherubim were watching them leave. The original exile established the baseline for the entire human story. We are all living east of Eden. We all feel the friction of living in a world that is not quite right. They carry whatever fractured pieces of their lives they can strap to their backs. Every few steps, a captive looks over their shoulder one last time, haunted by the deep memory of a home we have never seen. But if Eden was the first exile, how did an entire chosen nation end up repeating the exact same failure? The tragedy of the garden does not stay in the garden. It infects a family. And soon, it infects an empire. God initiates a rescue plan to bring humanity back. But ironically, the attempt to survive the exile leads them directly into a house of slavery. The mud is heavy. The sun is merciless. And the cracking of whips echoes across the construction yards of the Nile. Generations of Israelites are trapped in a cycle of brutal, back-breaking labor. They are building monuments for a king who considers himself a god, and they have been doing it for so long that most of them cannot remember what freedom looks like. They are stripped of their dignity, their identity, and their rest. This is Egypt, and it is the next massive escalation in the biblical story of exile. To understand how a chosen family ended up making bricks in the sun, we have to look at how humanity attempts to survive outside the garden. When God calls Abraham in Genesis 12, watching the fading light of a city they will never see again. Most readers of Scripture recognize this devastating moment. It is the famous Babylonian exile. The plan is to finally reverse the exile. Abraham is living in Ur, which is in Babylon, far to the east. God calls him to leave that pagan center and travel west, back toward the geography of Eden, to a new promised land. It seems like the perfect solution, but a famine strikes the land, and Abraham's family eventually journeys down into Egypt to find food. At first, Egypt looks like a place of provision. It looks like a safe shelter. But in the biblical narrative, humanity's attempts to secure its own survival in the exile almost always lead to a trap. Over 400 years, the shelter becomes a prison. Egypt becomes a variation of the Edenic exile, but with a terrifying new layer. In Eden, humanity was separated from God. In Egypt, they are not only separated, they are actively oppressed by a false system of power. They are living in the house of slavery. Then, the narrative shifts violently. God hears the groaning of the captives. He unleashes 10 devastating plagues, dismantles the false gods of the empire, and splits the sea to bring his people out. The Exodus is the great, foundational rescue operation of the Old Testament. It is a stunning display of deliverance. It is usually taught as an isolated historical lesson about the consequences of disobedience. The common assumption is straightforward. Israel worshipped foreign idols. But as the Israelites walk out of the water and into the wilderness, a hidden contradiction quickly emerges. The chains are gone, but the wandering continues. Within weeks of their miraculous rescue, while Moses is on the mountain receiving the covenant, the people panic. They gather their gold, melt it down, and build a golden calf. They complain about the wilderness and demand to go back to the garlic and the onions of Egypt. They are physically free, but internally, they are still desperately homesick for the very system that enslaved them. The problem is not that the Exodus failed. The problem is that the Exodus only solved the external crisis. God brought the people out of Egypt. But the wilderness reveals that it is much harder to get Egypt out of the people. This is the great, quiet tragedy of the Old Testament. The people are given a new law, a tabernacle, and a pathway to relationship with God. But the internal condition, the deep, fractured rebellion that started at the guarded gate of Eden, remains entirely unhealed. They are carrying the far country in their own chests. The Exodus proves that physical deliverance does not guarantee spiritual presence. You can change a person's geography without ever changing their heart. God finally lost patience, and a pagan empire was allowed to sweep them off the map. We read it as a localized story of human failure. Eventually, this rescued nation will cross the Jordan River. They will finally enter the Promised Land. They will build a golden city, crown kings, and construct a magnificent temple. It will look as though the original exile is finally over. But because the internal displacement was never cured, the external kingdom is resting on a massive fault line. The nation will soon tear itself in two, and a darker, more violent shadow will approach from the north. Dust rises on the northern horizon. The ground shakes with the weight of siege engines and the relentless rhythm of marching infantry. It is 722 BC. And the most ruthless military machine the ancient world has ever seen is standing at the gates of Samaria. The golden age of the Promised Land did not last. After the brief, unified glory of kings like David and Solomon, the nation had violently torn itself in two. 10 tribes formed the northern kingdom of Israel, and 2 tribes formed the southern kingdom of Judah. Almost immediately, the north slipped into a familiar pattern. They built their own shrines, set up golden calves, and began worshiping the gods of the surrounding nations. They were physically living in the Promised Land, followed by a divine eviction. The problem is not that this familiar interpretation is completely wrong. The problem is that we stop reading the geography too early. But spiritually, they had walked right back into Egypt. And then, the Assyrian Empire arrives. To understand the terror of this moment, we have to understand how Assyria waged war. The Assyrians did not merely defeat foreign armies. They specialized in psychological annihilation. When they conquered a territory, they did not just occupy the land and collect taxes. They systematically uprooted the surviving population, chained them together, and force-marched them hundreds of miles into foreign territory. At the same time, they would take conquered peoples from other parts of their empire and resettle them in the newly emptied land. The question is, why? Why go through the massive logistical burden of moving entire populations across the ancient Near East? The answer reveals the true, violent nature of exile. The Assyrians knew that if you take a man's land, he might rebel. But if you take a man from his home, mix his family into a foreign culture, and erase his language, he forgets who he is. Within 2 or 3 generations, the memory of his ancestors disappears completely. Exile is not just about losing real estate. It is about the violent erasure of identity. This is exactly what happened to the Northern Kingdom.